Well, I'd been telling you sooner or later it would happen, and it has finally happened. By the way, for those of you expecting the results from yesterday's local elections, I am actually filming this on the 4th, so it is still the 4th for me filming this. Probably we've either talked about the results maybe in a short video, or we'll be talking about them maybe a bit more, maybe later on. Like I say, look out for that video if you want those sort of results. But the other thing that I had sort of predicted we'd be talking about today is, of course, our favorite boy over at the Conservative home, the T-boy, everyone's favorite T-boy, William Atkinson. And he's finally done what I predicted he would really write. And of course, that is about the retained EU law bill. And of course, this was very much proposed and done by his fellow co-host, Jacob Rees-Mogg, on the Mogcast. They have talked about many times on that podcast just how bad and evil wanting to get rid of all these laws that he wants to get rid of are. But we've talked about how important some of these, retained laws are. The Working Time Directive is in these new 800 laws that have now been sort of watered down to, well, try and get rid of. As is flight compensation. We had the funny thing was we had another piece that had been written in Conservative Home, basically to try and codify, or at least mull, anyone who was really concerned that these, or at least this bill, had been watered down to just 800 by saying, oh, it doesn't really matter that ministers are arguing over EU washing machine legislation. It's just a waste of time. We should all just carry on and just move on with our lives. Meanwhile, there's more than just, shall we say, washing machine regulations in this bill, as we are trying to sort of continually tell people about. Even though they have watered this bill down significantly, it still has massive problems and is still big questions of, can this or not still pass the House of Lords? I still don't think it's going to be able to, because there are other powers in this bill which give ministers very much sweeping powers to get rid of laws and regulations without any parliamentary oversight. And if someone in Parliament does want to save this bill, then they have to go through this massive, deliberate, labyrinthian process to try and save it, built deliberately by Jacob Rees-Mogg to make it as hard as possible for anyone to try and save these laws, which was always the goal in the first place. Try and get rid of as many regulations as possible, because they knew they couldn't get rid of all these 4,000 laws. Hence why Mogg came and said, oh, it's only 2,000. And then we found out, no, it was significantly more when they'd had a look at these laws that were on the books. But big problem. So what's Will's take on this? Pro-Brexiteer that he certainly is. There was also a big case to be made about what Badenoch does next, because really no one knew who Kemi Badenoch was before Michael Gove had plucked her from obscurity and backed her to run in the Conservative leadership race. And she made it to sort of the third, pretty much the third, well, is it the third round she made it to before she dropped out? And then, of course, Rishi Sunak brought her in as the trade secretary. And as we've seen not too long ago, she's now polling second in the big sort of poll of ministers. But as we've seen before, that doesn't necessarily say that she is actually good at her job. Like I say, going by those polls and everything else, according to that, Liz Truss was absolutely fantastic until, of course, as we've seen, she actually has to do the job. And for all intents and purposes, really, Badenoch hasn't really done that too many fantastic things, to be honest, at the moment. So while at the moment she may be riding high on a big popularity piece at the moment, I don't think that potentially will last forever. But Anyway, we're going to go cracking on into this to find out what what Will thinks about this retained EU law bill and how annoyed he is or maybe isn't that Badenoch has watered down his favourite piece of legislation that we may remember just a couple of weeks ago. We covered just how enthusiastic he was for the retained EU law bill. So let's carry on into this then, shall we? But before we do that, please do remember to click on the like, share, and subscribe button. And of course, down below there are links to my Patreon page and a one-off link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can Buy Me Coffee. And of course, as always, thank you very much to all those people who do help and support the channel. Like I said, there's the YouTube thank you button, and of course, the Pony Club down below as well. So, over we go to Conservative Home. The title of the retained EU law bill: Is Badenoch betraying Brexit or saving doomed legislation? The Daily Telegraph reported that Kimmy Badenoch is abandoning plans to review, junk, or retain all 4,000 pieces of retained EU law by the end of this year and has drawn the ire of my fellow Brexiteers. The Business Secretary's suggestion that only a likely 800 would be scrapped by the deadline of this year's end appears to be a surrender in the face of unwilling civil servants and trade union lobbying. So that's why. That's what he's blaming it on. These unwilling civil servants. Yeah, this is the new blame train we're getting on now, because after all, can't blame the EU anymore. Try as many of these Tories might. Oh, it's just those unwilling civil servants that are real the problem here. How dare they? There's been never any evidence provided by these Conservatives or by any of these ministers that civil servants are unwilling to do the job that they're saying it would be. But there you go. And of course, trade unionist lobbying. Yes, they are lobbying to save these rules and regulations, because some of these rules and regulations are important cornerstones of many of the workers' rights, which have been fought for very, very hard for many years. So yes, of course, trade unions are lobbying to try and keep some of these regulations, just as they are trying to lobby to keep the working time directive, which again is still in those 800 of those laws currently to be scrapped. But it continues. So it just rubs further salt in their wounds. The post-Windsor Framework One European Research Group source told the GB News that Badenoch is a, quote, lame minister who is having run rings around her by Remainer officials, another Conservative MP said. Again, any excuse. Oh, it's not Badenoch's fault. It's not the fact that she's the minister in charge of all this stuff. No, it's just she's being run rings around all those those Remainer civil servants. That's the problem here. Again, where's the evidence that they're running rings around her? So, and then the other coup de grace, that Badenoch is proving to be a huge disappointment, and has the former Eurosceptic daring betrayed the Brexit cause. Readers may be surprised to know that I was something of a Badenoch skeptic. No surprise there. When I saw commentators jumping on a bandwagon during last summer's leadership election, my natural instinct was to run in the opposite direction. I saw little sense in making someone with no cabinet experience prime minister in the middle of a national crisis just because she was playing to some of the Tory right's favourite tunes. Shockingly, it's not just that. Like I say, Badenoch pretty much ran on culture wars. That's what she ran on. And even though she became pretty much a darling of the Tory right, I actually agree with Atkinson here. She'd been plucked from obscurity. She'd never had big level cabinet experience. She'd only really been a junior minister serving under Michael Gove in the office for the Department for Levelling Up. That had been her only ministerial experience. So I actually agree with Will's assessment here. Why would you make someone like that prime minister? It's a valid point. Yet, I have been quietly impressed and happily proven wrong by how she has got on with her job so far. A decision on the retained EU law bill should not be seen as Badenoch backsliding, but as an attempt to save a piece of legislation that was becoming increasingly unworkable. By stripping back the bill, she hopes to get royal assent as soon as possible, rather than seeing it bogged down in the House of Lords. It's still going to get massively bogged down in the House of Lords. Even if you strip it down to just 800, there are still big questions to be asked about many of these pieces of legislation that would just disappear overnight if you went through with this law. There's still the big question about the deadline. There's big questions about, even though there's only 800, what about the rest of those retained EU law bills and those powers that this bill gives ministers the power to get rid of those laws? So there's still big, big questions. I still do not see this really performing that well in the House of Lords. It is going to get bogged down. And I think they are desperate to try and pass this, especially the Brexiteers, especially the free market fundamentalists who see this as sort of a massive opportunity once that happens to start ripping out pieces of legislation left, right, and center. So, a quick reminder of what the bill is and what it seeks to do. Last summer, Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss tried to outcompete each other with increasingly outlandish promises as to how quickly they would scrap retained EU law, the category of law bestowed by EU membership and transferred into domestic legislation by Theresa May's 2008 EU Withdrawal Act. The original timetable was by the end of 2026. Truss promised by 2023, and Sunak one-upped her by suggesting it within the first 100 days of becoming Prime Minister. Since the former won, 2023 it became. Even if in the refill bill was only actually introduced into the Commons on the day that Sunak replaced her as Prime Minister, Badenoch is now a custodian of Jacob Rees-Mogg's passion project. Exactly. It's not only just Jacob Rees-Mogg's passion project, this is the Brexiteer passion project. This is why there has been such a fury and uproar at the watering down of this. And this is just another example of the Tories betraying Brexit. And like I say, Sunak has no and should not really want to sort of fulfill this, Jacob Rees-Mogg's passion project, because even then there was big questions as to whether this bill would be voted on and passed or not. Big questions about that. But Will continues. So the bill, as originally planned, would revoke almost all EU-derived legislation by the end of 2023 via the sunset provisions. The Cinderella-like, if it was not retained by midnight on December the 31st, it would disappear. The legislation would also abolish the principle of supremacy of EU law, remove the principles of EU law from the UK's domestic law, and give courts the power to diverge from EU case law. And as we've said before, this would be massively negatively affect a ton of case law, and what this could potentially affect for things for even like parental guardianship and ownership. It could affect hundreds of stuff just to remove EU law on this case. It would massively upset huge rulings previously in the past. So even if those and that is still a big question of whether this will actually pass or not. That is a very big question on that. So this controversy arose for a variety of reasons. Originally, the government thought that there were around 2,400 retained EU laws, until the National Archives found over 1,400 more down the back of the sofa. And again, he's saying, they were just down the back. No, it was very clearly put forward at the time. Mogg had not done his own research. He clearly had not done his own research enough to substantiate these amount of laws. In fact, it was originally around about 2,000 laws initially. I think Will's inflated the number again on this, because it was originally around 2,000. Then a campaign group of lawyers said, well, actually, There's potentially a further 4,000 more laws that this would happen. And then the National Archives came in and said, well, actually, there's a further 2,000 laws that your EU retained law bill would also affect. So, not, not really a full sort of retelling of what happened, but, well, fair enough. So, businesses, trade unions, and lobby groups complained that they would not know which laws would be set to disappear until perilously close to the New Year's Eve deadline, which was again completely true. They wouldn't know. They wouldn't know at all. It would be an absolute disaster, and most importantly, what Will's not mentioning, would blow massive holes in UK legislation, because many of the EU laws we have actually built on top of. And as we've described this bill before, it is like building a house. You've built the house and you go, oh, well, I don't like the foundation, so I'm going to blow up the foundations. Well, if you get rid of the foundations or you blow up the foundations, what do you think happens to the rest of the house? Or go into the house and said, yes, this load-bearing wall, I don't like this load-bearing wall anymore, so I'm going to get rid of it. What do you think happens? So, most importantly, this bill would enable ministers to revoke any secondary retained EU law and replace it with such provisions as relevant national authorized considerers to be appropriate and to achieve the same or similar objectives. In short, it would hand the executive vast powers to change laws without parliamentary scrutiny. Exactly the sort of thing we used to moan about Brussels doing. At least he acknowledges that. Like I say, Brexiteers were meant to be all about parliamentary sovereignty. Why are then you doing this? And of course, that's the point. The Brexiteers not really consistent when it came to Brexit. So all this meant that the bill was set for significant opposition in the House of Lords, but with a busy legislative timetable and a clock ticking down, both towards both of December deadline and the next election, this was to delay the best avoided for those who would like the supremacy of EU law to finally fully end and the process of deregulation to begin. Again, at least he admits what the aim of this bill was, to begin the process of deregulation. But again, deregulation of what? Of what laws specifically? And what exactly do you want to deregulate? The working time directive will be fine if Conservative Home said, okay, well, we want you to write straight for the next 38 hours. And Will would have no comeback. He would have no legal recourse to come back, because the working time directive said you can only really force someone to work this many hours when it comes to a week. Any more than that, or any sort of forced overtime, is what it was really meant to be doing, businesses can't force you to do. You can only choose to work that overtime if you so choose to. So, as such, it is time. It is time not to let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and avoid the melancholy long withdrawing roar of the ERG. And we are approaching halfway through the year, and Badenoch has revealed to MPs that civil servants have yet to analyse all 4,000 pieces of legislation. Even if the bill could pass the laws unamended, that raises the question of whether it is practically deliverable. Right from day one, everyone has said this bill is just not practically deliverable. Right from day one, that is nothing new. Now you're saying, oh well, it raises the question of it's practically deliverable. No, right from day one, that's been the main criticism. Back when you first wrote about the retained EU law bill, we did a video saying, no, these entire 4,000 pieces of legislation, you can't just go like that, because you've got to find out what the consequences are going to be getting rid of that. And more importantly, what are the consequences if you decide to get rid of the EU law and supremacy? Does that also have effect on things like the retained and withdrawal agreement, the Windsor Protocol as well. There's a ton of stuff this bill does not take into account. That's why it's such, as people have said, it is such a badly written piece of legislation. So, from what I hear, parts of Whitehall have turned an exercise into repealing legislation into one of retaining it. Under the nose of the ministers and statutory instruments have all been used to ensure as little change as occurs as possible. Brexiteers' fears of a civil of a civil service hostile to their aims are not unfounded, which raises the obvious question of why we would trust them with such an important task. Would you? That's what civil servants do, and they are going. Well, actually, if we get rid of this law, it causes other problems. And as we've said, many of the EU laws and sort of regulations we have built on. So if you get rid of that EU law, what happens to the rest of those British laws that were created on top of that law? This has been brought up since day one. And yet this is still the main criticism. And of course, now he's trying to blame, oh, it's just the civil servants. But yes, they're trying to keep many of these rules and laws and regulations, because if you get rid of it, it will be an absolute nightmare and would create massive black holes and legal loopholes in a ton of legal laws and regulations. We've said it right from the very beginning. This piece of legislation was written by Jacob Rees-Mogg with an absolute purpose to try and get rid of as many as regulations as he possibly could, knowing full well that he wouldn't be able to get rid of all of them, but he could get rid of enough of them, but give ministers like him further powers to just start Thanos snapping laws left and right out of existence. And this is what also is worried by civil servants, because they are fully well going, yeah, some of these we can't really afford to get rid of. And they're not doing it under the noses of ministers. This is what civil servants do all the time. So, and this is a good one. Eurosceptics also need to be clear as to which regulations they want repealed. Will, I will tell you full well, Eurosceptics are not clear. They are never clear, deliberately so, because they know if they went out and actually started telling people what the regulations they wanted to get rid of, people might be a bit against that. The government has already committed to retaining some of the most important EU-derived laws, including prominent pieces of environmental legislation and, of course, the Working Time Directive. Before one blames Sunak for being socialist, I'd point out that scrapping the latter was kiboshed by Truss's number 10. It's been long. It's been one of the ones that they wanted to get rid of. Like I say, this is one of the ones that they sort of want to say because it doesn't look good. Certainly on the doorsteps of the next general election, you Tories come around and say, "Oh well, we got rid of the Working Time Directive." This basically means your boss can now force you to work overtime. That's why the Working Time Directive exists. It's not going to play well for the Tories if they get rid of it. So, what Badenoch reportedly now intends to draw up is a list of 800 or so undesirable EU laws to show to the Lords to try and grease the bill's passage. Again, what 800 laws are these to be? And of course, what's the consequence of, as we've said, getting rid of one of those laws? Because most of the EU retained laws we have built upon. And if you get rid of that, it's like, as we've said before, you go back to the house analogy, you get rid of the foundations, what happens to the rest of the house? So when asked for further bad laws that they would like to see gone, ERG members could reportedly only come up with, quote, product standards, something Badenoch, as business secretary, was not wholeheartedly pleased to hear. And again, if you get rid of product standards, that stops businesses in the UK trading with the EU. So one should note that all the retained EU law bill is not the sum of the government's deregulatory effects. A consultation is being held on data protection laws, on financial services, and a consultation was held with the government is now proceeding with primary legislation. Having the scrutiny, having the security of the retained EU law bill lacks. So you can also track the reform of EU laws via this nifty retained EU law dashboard. Badenoch has also inherited the retained EU law bill that was being very much undermined by Whitehall. Again, evidence, please, that civil servants are undermining your precious bill. This was loathed by the groups that it was supposed to help, and by the fact that it's being scuppered by the House of Lords. There's one figure involved in the legislation put it to me: the midnight deadline has been created a perverse incentive by forcing civil servants to rush to retain rather than to repeal rules. To inject energy to the whole process needed a complete rethink. So, in 1 or 2 months, the Badenoch has been overseeing this bill. That is exactly what she has done. It may not be the big bang that some Brexiteers were hoping for, but it will end the supremacy of EU law, which will also cause massive legal problems. Something that is, again, also being brought up in the House of Lords as well, because what does that mean if you end the supremacy of EU law for something that was, um, the what do you call it now? It's kind of out of my head. It's like the supremacy of that particular law precedent. What do you get rid of if there was precedent for that law, and that just precedent happened to be set by EU law? It blows open big questions into that. So don't expect that problem to go away. The idea that this is going to end supremacy of EU law. Well, what about precedent? Because there's a lot of precedent that has been set by EU law. What does that mean? So it will end the supremacy of EU law and begin the process of deregulation in a way that doesn't alienate business. If this is, quote, betraying Brexit, then what on earth isn't? Again, Will's having probably I've said before. I think a bit of a midlife Brexit crisis. Certainly, when he sees his precious Brexit try to be done, he's all of a sudden backing off. But then previously, he'd be writing pieces about how fantastic, how amazing this piece of EU sort of legislation is. And like I say, we've sort of been following him and his writing of these pieces, very much trying to sort of promote this idea that this is a good bill. But as we've covered this time and time again, you look at all the experts, the legal experts, they've constantly said this bill, this piece of legislation is poorly written. And I would say, and I've always maintained, that this bill has been poorly written on purpose because it had the exact idea to get rid of as many EU laws as possible, knowing full well that they wouldn't be able to get rid of them all, but they could get rid of enough of them. If they get rid of enough of them, then they can slowly start to unpick others. And those powers that are still in the retained EU law bill is still very much a potential Trojan horse. Even if this is watered down and it's only 800, there's very little chance with the rest of the powers that are still in this bill. I mean, as we've said before, what does this do to precedent? What does this do to precedent that has been set by EU law? That has big implications. And not only that, what does this mean for things like in the withdrawal agreement? What does this mean when it brings to things like the Windsor Framework? There are still big questions. And as he is trying to sort of big up Badenoch, that I was once a Badenoch skeptic. Now I'm sort of happy. To be honest, all intents and purposes, she has not really performed as well as you are claiming will. If anything, she is desperately trying to um, get a bill passed, which I think she knows herself will cause big problems further down the line. Certainly, businesses, trade unions, they do not want it. They do not want this at all. And remember, it's not just those laws that go, it's also the powers that are in this bill as well that are also set to cause massive problems as well. So, as always, thank you very much for watching. And of course, as always, please remember to click on the like, share, and subscribe button. And of course, until next time, we'll see you all very soon.